Chapter 9, the central nervous system. So here we'll focus on just the central nervous system, looking at the spinal cord, the brain, and their function. So remember, the central nervous system has to be protected. We need this extra layer of protection, and that's created with the blood-brain barrier. And if you recall from our nervous system chapter, we learned about astrocytes, these glial cells. And what they do is they secrete a paracrine. A paracrine is just a chemical that's released from one cell that acts on a neighboring cell. And in this case, it causes tight junctions to form. And those tight junctions prevent free exchange from happening. And so for anything to get into the central nervous system, it has to be able to go through the cells as opposed to just going through these pores. Now, certain things can pass very easily into the brain because the brain has its own metabolic needs. So oxygen, for example, can freely cross the blood-brain barrier, and the brain receives about 15% of the blood pumped by the heart and uses that much oxygen. Glucose is another thing that will easily move into the brain, and the brain actually consumes half, 50% of the glucose. And so we really want to make sure that the brain has enough supply of glucose. Otherwise, we may suffer from hypoglycemia, emia blood. Hypo means low. Think of glycemia as glucose. And so when you have low blood glucose, it leads to things like confusion. You can become unconscious, and it can lead to death. Now, the nervous system is highly organized. So one way we can separate it is between gray and white matter. So gray matter contains your unmyelinated nerves, your cell bodies, dendrites, axon terminals, basically everything that doesn't have myelin around it. White matter is white because of myelin. So the myelinated axons you would find here, and there are some cell bodies. So here, if we take a look at the spinal cord, you can see the white matter and you can see the gray matter. So they're separated. It's organized. In addition, even within the gray and white matter, we have further organization. For example, in the dorsal horn, you can see somatic sensory nuclei are located way up here in pink, versus visceral sensory nuclei are located here in purple. So you can see there's even organization within the gray matter and within the white matter. So everything in green, these contain your ascending tracts, so the myelinated axons that are going to send information up to the brain. Everything in blue contains your descending tracts, so the myelinated axons that's going to send information down from the brain to the spinal cord. Now, why is it important to know this anatomical structure? Because let's say someone had a spinal cord injury and they can feel, but they cannot move. So that tells you the injury may be in the I said they can feel. Okay, so they can feel, so the ascending tracts are fine. They remain, but the descending tracts may be compromised. So it can give you an idea of what part of the spinal cord and what area and what level, depending on what part of the body is being compromised, the injury may be located at. Now, the spinal cord can also act as an integrating center, meaning it can make a decision and without the need of the brain. So here's an example. A stimulus came in, the sensory neurons brought the information through the dorsal root into the dorsal horn, and this inner neuron then relayed the information to the motor neuron, and the information went right back out to cause a response. So notice the brain was not involved in this case in deciding how to respond. So that tells you the spinal cord can be an integrating center. This is basically a spinal reflex. So that when you go to the doctors and they hit your patellar tendon and your leg shoots up, that would be an example of a spinal reflex. Really quickly, an inner neuron is a neuron that's completely within the central nervous system between two neurons. So the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, so that's an inner neuron. Now, the brainstem is also part of the CNS. We have the brainstem made up of the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. The medulla conveys information between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. This is also where your pyramids are located. Now, you know that the right side of the brain controls and receives information from the left side of the body and vice versa. That means somewhere the neurons have to cross to the other side. 90% of the crossing happens here in the pyramids of the medulla. The other 10% happens at the level of the spinal cord. It also contains centers for involuntary functions, including respiration. The pons relays information between the cerebellum and the cerebrum, and things like respiration, cardiac function, and urinary function are involved here. And then the midbrain controls eye movement, relays auditory and visual reflexes. And then really quickly, the cerebellum, which is way back here, processes sensory information and also helps with balance and coordination. Now within the brain, we also have the diencephalon. Okay, so it's blown up right here. It's made up of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the pineal gland. So the thalamus is really important for relaying and modifying information that goes to and from the cerebral cortex. So basically you can think of it as most anything, any information tracks neurons that's going to go from the brain to the spinal cord and vice versa. They have to go through this guy first. Not all, but most, majority. And a little bit of relaying of the information, modifying it, and then the thalamus helps to send it to the correct area of the brain. The hypothalamus, shown here in yellow, controls a lot of things that's important for homeostasis. And we'll look at all of the things that it controls in the next slide. It also can influence the pituitary, and the pituitary is important for hormone secretion. And then the pineal gland back here is an endocrine gland, and this guy secretes the hormone melatonin. So the hypothalamus, I said, does a lot of things, and here's a nice table that goes over all of its functions. So one is it can activate the sympathetic nervous system. So when you have that fight or flight emergency that you need, that you're in and you need the sympathetic to activate, the hypothalamus will accomplish that. Body temperature is also regulated here, as well as blood and body osmolarity. So it can, if you are dehydrated, it'll make you feel thirsty so that you'll drink. Reproductive functions are also controlled here because it can release hormones that control reproduction. This is also where food intake is regulated. Okay, so if you're always hungry, the hypothalamus can be one of the guys that's involved in making you always feel hungry. It also interacts with the limbic system. So the limbic system is important for emotion. And this is why when you have very strong emotions, like you're depressed or something like that, you have a lot of physiological responses that go along with it because the hypothalamus is involved there. It can influence cardiovascular control centers in the medulla. And again, it can help the release of hormones from the pituitary, so it has this endocrine function as well. The gray matter of the cerebrum, shown here, let's kind of break that down. So we have the cerebral cortex that's involved in higher brain functions. The basal ganglia, shown here in pink, is involved in the control of movement. And then the limbic system, like I said earlier, is really important for emotion. The hippocampus is also part of the limbic system, and that's important for learning and memory. And that's easy to remember because think of a smart hippopotamus. If we take a closer look at the cerebral cortex, not only is it important for higher brain function, reasoning, etc., it's also specialized in terms of functions and which part of the cerebral cortex accomplishes that. For example, you have your somatosensory cortex, important for you to sense all of the sensory input that came in and to perceive that information. The motor cortices help with movement, and we also have association cortices. Now, there's another way we can look at the brain. We can look at the hemispheres of the brain. And each hemisphere of the brain, right or left, can be specialized for performing certain tasks or better at doing certain things. And this is the idea of cerebral lateralization. So if you are, let's say, left brain dominant or left hemisphere dominant, remember, the left side of the brain controls and feels from the right side of the body, so you may be right-handed, and you may be really good at language, verbal skills, math and science. You're very logical. You think linearly. If you are right hemisphere dominant, you may be left-handed, and you may be good at spatial skills. You're very visual. You are very artistic and creative. So no one is going to be just one side of the brain working. Obviously, both hemispheres work, but you may be better at certain things. So you may be more right brain versus more left brain. You can have equal dominance, and because our brain is plastic, meaning it can change. Experience can also influence which side of the brain becomes more dominant over time. All right, so let's move on to sleep. So when you sleep, does your brain also shut off? It does not. So when they record brain function, we're talking about EEG, so electroencephalograms. They basically put electrodes on the brain and they asked people to sleep, and they found, hey, the brain is actually quite active during sleep. And we can break down the stages of sleep into two major phases. We have our REM and our non-REM. So REM stands for rapid eye movement. So during REM sleep, the brain activity, this is actually where dreaming takes place. So this is when you're dreaming, but your body is essentially paralyzed. So your brain will actually inhibit motor neurons to skeletal muscles so that you don't act out your dreams. So when you see people dreaming, you'll see their eyes kind of shifting around under their eyelids, but their body is not going to move. In non-REM sleep, this is where body movement takes place, and dreaming does not. All right, so I mentioned briefly earlier that our emotions can have physiological manifestations because the limbic system and our hypothalamus are linked to one another. And moods are similar to emotions, but they last longer, and we can have mood disorders. The fourth leading cause of illness worldwide is depression. And if you suffer from or know anyone who has been depressed, you'll notice they'll have sleep disturbances, appetite changes, changes in mood, libido, and then they may need antidepressant drugs. And why is that? Because the limbic system directly feeds into the hypothalamus. And we know the hypothalamus can control a lot of things, including food intake, right? Your reproductive function. So basically, that's why we have these physiological manifestations. Okay. Learning and memory. Obviously, that's an important function of the brain. And there are two broad types of learning. We have associative and non-associative. Associative learning is when you are going to associate two stimuli with each other. And the classic example is Pavlov's dog. So this is where the scientist would ring the bell and give the dog food. And the dog would learn to associate the bell with the food. So eventually, when the dog just would hear the sound of the bell, they would know that food was coming, so they'll start to salivate. Non-associative learning is learning in response to a single stimuli. And two examples are habituation and sensitization. Habituation is a decreased response to a repeated stimuli. So if there's a loud noise, at first it'll startle you and you'll really notice it. But if that noise continues on and on, after a while, you don't even hear it. And then sensitization. This is an increased response to a repeated stimulus. So if you rub your arm, at first it just feels a little warm, but if it's repeated over and over, it starts to then feel painful. Now, we want to not just learn, but we want to remember. Memory, we can divide into short-term and long-term memory. Short-term memory is exactly that. It's short-term. It holds about 7 to 12 pieces or chunks of information at a time and can last from minutes to days, but it doesn't last forever. Long-term memory is capable of holding vast amounts of information. And how do you get from short term to long term? The process is called consolidation. And really, there's no magic to it. It's about repetition. So you have to repeat and practice, and then short term memory will consolidate into long term, and it will stay much longer in your brain. Now, some information can take just seconds to turn into long-term memory. Others can take minutes. Sometimes you guys might think it takes hours. And it depends on who you are and what you're kind of gifted at. So if you're very musical, you might be able to hear a song once and you already know the lyrics. Versus if you are not, I am not, I can hear a song 100 times and I still kind of mumble through and barely learn the chorus. Okay. Other types of long-term memory. We have reflexive, also known as implicit memory, and declarative, also known as explicit memory. So reflexive or implicit is implied. It's a reflex. It's automatic recall. You don't need to be consciously paying attention. It's acquired slowly through, again, that magic word, repetition. Think of driving home. If you've ever driven home late at night after a really hard, long day, you might get in the car to drive home, and then the next thing you remember, or the next thing you realize, you're home, and you don't actually recall the driving home part. Okay, you don't recall getting on the freeway, getting off the freeway, stopping at lights, but you made it home safely. Why? Because you constantly and always take that same route, so it was automatic. Okay, so I'm not promoting that, but that's just one example. Declarative memory, also known as explicit memory, the recall requires conscious attention. So this is more of the higher level thinking skills where you can do things like inferences, comparisons, evaluation. So here you have to be a lot more aware. This is not a patho class, but one disease related to memory loss is Alzheimer's disease. Okay, another function of the brain is language. So language skills requires input from sensory information through hearing, through vision. We will process that information, and then we have to coordinate an output, either speaking or writing. Now, two areas of the brain are particularly important. They are Wernicke's area and Broca's area. And I'm going to talk about it based on what happens when those areas are damaged. So when you have damage to Wernicke's area, it causes something called receptive aphasia. Receptive aphasia means you have problems receiving information, so you're unable to understand spoken or visual information. So someone might ask you, where do you want to eat? But that is not what you hear. Damage to Broca's area, okay, causes expressive aphasia. So in expressive aphasia, you have problems expressing what you want to say. So if someone asks you, what do you want to eat? You know that's what they said, but you can't express your answer that you want to go get a salad. So you can understand spoken and written language, but you're unable to speak or write in a normal syntax. So one example is you might just say numbers. Where you're like, in your head, you want to answer, I want to get a salad, but what you're actually saying is like 4725, and that's just one example. Okay. Finally, another function of the brain is personality, and personality is going to be a combination of experience and inheritance. So you can look to your parents, but obviously your experience will also shape your personality. Schizophrenia is an example of a brain disorder that has both a genetic and environmental component. So the risk of developing schizophrenia in the US is about 1%, but if you have a family history, if one parent has it, then your risk jumps to 10%. And that is chapter 9. Thank you.